why do we actively punish people for using the best, newest tools available to them? Why is there this underlying institutional fear when success, something that was once really difficult, suddenly becomes effortless? I think the answer is it's embedded deep within our cultural fear of success without a visible struggle.
That tension right there,
Yeah.
that paradox of progress. I mean, that is the core issue of human intellectual evolution right now. We are building these systems that accelerate success, and yet our own structures, they're designed to reward the struggle, the
Yeah.
old linear process.
Absolutely. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking a really deep exploration into the very architecture of change itself. We're not just looking at what new ideas are emerging in science and technology. We're looking at fundamentally how they spread,
Yeah.
how we judge their legitimacy, and why, despite having these incredible tools, our collective intellectual development seems to be falling linearly behind this exponential technological growth.
It's a perfect setup because the sources you shared with us, they essentially map out the intellectual battlefield where this tension plays out. We have the foundational sociological work on how ideas are adopted. That's Everett Rogers' classic diffusion of innovation theory. Then we have the philosophical framework for truth and rigor, Karl Popper's falsifiability. And finally, we've got these cutting-edge analyses focused on the institutional impact and, frankly, the disruption caused by artificial intelligence.
So our mission today is to connect these seemingly disparate threads: sociology, philosophy, and computer science. And through that, we hope to diagnose the central dilemma. It's this slow, messy, bias-ridden process of human adoption versus the ruthless, exponential speed of technological advance. It's a cognitive and systemic race against ourselves, really.
And that's where the high stakes become so clear. The existential itch this whole discussion scratches is really this. Why, after inventing machines that think faster than we can, are we intellectually lagging behind our own creations? We're creating this accelerating certainty with technologies governed by Moore's Law and now Huang's Law, yet our organizations, our education, our habits, they're adapting at this sluggish linear rate. It feels like we're running a marathon while the technology is traveling by jet.
And if we're going to define a villain in this narrative, it feels like a two-headed monster. It's both internal and external. First, you have the individual, right? The internal resistance, this personal psychological lock we put on our minds. In psychology, they call it cognitive inertia or belief perseverance. It's just the sheer mental effort it takes to update a core belief.
And the second head of that monster is the systemic barrier, the external forces, institutional rigidity. I mean, think of the monolithic power of standardized education or bureaucratic inertia in big corporations, or just conformist assessment systems. These things are inherently designed to perpetuate the status quo. They filter out disruptive novelty. They end up punishing the revolutionary idea and only rewarding the renovative, that slow incremental improvement.
Okay, so let's unpack this battle with our first foundational piece of research: diffusion of innovation. The reason I find this theory so compelling is that its origins are just so humble. It didn't start in some sterile tech lab or a Silicon Valley firm brainstorming the next killer app.
That's absolutely right. To understand the future of AI adoption, we actually have to go back.
Yeah.
We have to start with Everett Rogers' seminal DOI theory, which, as you said, began in a delightfully rustic place, Iowa fields.
Hybrid corn. I mean, it really does sound like the least glamorous subject for a scientific revolution.
And yet, between 1928, when researchers first started studying how farmers were adopting it, and 1940, when hybrid corn was basically used by all corn growers in Iowa, this simple agricultural innovation revealed these universal laws about how ideas spread, how they move through a social system. Rogers synthesized all these findings and published Diffusion of Innovations back in 1962. And he gave us a framework we still use. I mean, we use it for everything from smartphones to vaccines.
So if we strip away the academic jargon,
Right.
what exactly is diffusion according to Rogers?
He defined it as the process by which an innovation, so a new idea, a practice, an object, is communicated through channels over time among the members of a social system. Now, that sounds a bit dry, I know, but the key takeaway is what makes it unique. It's a specific kind of communication. It's aimed at achieving mutual understanding about that new idea, because the innovation itself, just by being new, creates uncertainty. And that uncertainty motivates people to seek information to evaluate it. So diffusion, at its core, is the process of uncertainty reduction.
Uncertainty reduction. That's the powerful core motive, isn't it? And it also confirms that adoption isn't driven by objective scientific facts, but by how the innovation is, well, how it's perceived. Which brings us to the famous 5 attributes.
Precisely. The individual's subjective perception of these 5 characteristics is the most powerful predictor of how fast an innovation will be adopted. If you change any one of these 5 perceptions, you can accelerate or delay the entire S-curve.
Okay, let's look at the first one. Relative advantage. This just asks, is the innovation seen as better than the idea it's replacing? If yes, adoption rate goes up. But that term better is crucial because it's not just about technical efficiency.
Right. And if we look at the source material on the acceptance of cultured meat, we see this subjectivity in action. Objectively, cultured meat might have a huge environmental advantage over traditional livestock. That's a fact. But the source showed that while ethical and environmental motives had, a weak positive correlation to acceptance, sensory motives, taste and texture, showed a weak negative one. So if the consumer perceives the sensory experience as poor, the high objective advantage is just. It's negated by that poor subjective perception.
That's a phenomenal example of the gap between science and psychology. Okay, second is compatibility. Does this new idea fit with existing values, past experiences, and the adopter's current workflows?
Compatibility is the quiet killer of so many brilliant technologies. A new software system, let's say, might be 20% faster than the old one.
Yeah.
But if adopting it requires months of retraining and it violates established norms of privacy or data sharing, its compatibility score just plummets. Adoption grinds to a halt, not because the tech is bad, but because it asks too much of the existing cognitive infrastructure.
Third is complexity. And this is the only one with a negative correlation, right? If the innovation is seen as difficult to understand and use, adoption plummets. This is why user interface and user experience design UI/UX have become so critical in the digital age.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the early days of personal computers versus, say, the introduction of the smartphone. The complexity barrier for the PC required specialized knowledge, installation procedures. The complexity barrier for the iPhone was near zero. It reduced the perceived difficulty of connecting to the internet by giving you this highly intuitive interface. Reducing that perceived complexity is often way more important than increasing actual functional power.
Fourth, trialability. Can I experiment with it on a restricted, low-risk basis? The ability to just dip your toe in the water massively increases adoption because it directly reduces that initial fear of uncertainty we were talking about.
This is why modern software adoption leans so heavily on freemium models, beta programs, sandbox testing environments. If an organization can test a new AI integration on a single low-stakes project without committing the whole company to some expensive high-risk overhaul, they have the necessary psychological safety net to move forward.
And finally, observability. Are the results and outcomes visible to others? If I can see my peer succeeding with a new technology, I'm far more likely to adopt it. This moves the decision from an abstract intellectual problem to a concrete social reality.
And this is so crucial. People generally don't adopt something based on an expert's scientific paper. They adopt based on the subjective evaluations of their peers, the people who serve as social models. When hybrid corn started to yield visibly higher crops in one farmer's field, his neighbors adopted it. That immediate visible success is far more persuasive than a university bulletin.
So this whole adoption process, it follows that S-shaped curve over time. It starts slow, hits a critical mass, and then spreads rapidly. And this curve is populated by the 5 adopter categories based on how quickly they jump on the idea.
Yes, at the very front of the curve, you've got the innovators. Just 2.5%. They're the adventurous ones, often cosmopolitan, the ones who introduce the idea. They accept risks that others won't.
Then come the early adopters, 13.5%. And these are the crucial bridge builders, aren't they? They're closely integrated into social networks, often the opinion leaders. They are the first to really implement the innovation after the innovators test it. Their approval is what drives the idea into the mainstream. Without them, the idea just dies.
It dies on the vine, exactly. Next, the masses arrive. The early majority, 34%. These are deliberate followers. They adopt soon enough, but only once they see the idea has been validated by those early adopters. They're the ones who solidify that reduction of uncertainty for everyone else.
Followed closely by the late majority, another 34%. These are the folks who are skeptical at first. They often adopt primarily due to economic necessity or massive peer pressure. They adopt way late in the cycle, basically when not adopting becomes riskier than adopting.
And finally, you have the laggards, 16%. They are traditional, often isolated. They demonstrate the longest decision-making processes. They're deeply suspicious of change, and tradition is their main reference point. Sometimes they even become the late discontinuers of old ideas, the very last people to stop doing things the old way.
So the lesson here is about communication flow. Mass media is great for creating initial knowledge about an innovation. Just getting the word out to the whole system quickly.
But the personal network is the true decision engine. Interpersonal channels, meaning peers, colleagues, social models, are exponentially more effective in forming or changing attitudes toward the new idea. And that's what ultimately influences the decision to adopt or reject. The social network is the mechanism that shifts belief from just passive knowledge to active commitment.
So understanding the social system is half the equation. But Rogers also defined how an individual processes this information, the innovation decision process. It's a structured five-step activity, again, motivated by that need to reduce uncertainty.
Right. And these 5 stages are so critical because they show us the psychological work that is required to accept a new idea. The first is just knowledge, simple exposure, understanding how it works.
Second is persuasion. And this is the subjective heart of the process, right? The individual actively seeks out evaluation information and forms an attitude favorable or unfavorable. This is where those subjective attributes like compatibility and relative advantage are weighed against personal needs and existing beliefs.
Yeah, exactly. Third is the decision, the choice to adopt or reject. But what's fascinating here is that the user often engages in what Rogers called reinvention at this stage. They modify the innovation during the process of adoption and implementation to better suit their own specific context.
And that reinvention element is profound. It means the idea that diffuses isn't static, it's an ecology that changes through adoption. The user isn't some passive recipient, they are an active creative partner in the evolution of the technology itself.
Absolutely. Fourth is implementation, putting the innovation to use, integrating it into the system's activities. This is where the real organizational change happens.
And finally, confirmation. The individual seeks reinforcement for the decision they've already made, but this stage is fraught with potential failure. There's discontinuance. If they get conflicting messages, or if the innovation is harder to use than they expected, or if a better idea surfaces, they might just reject the idea entirely, which confirms that the decision isn't final, it's always subject to reassessment.
So who survives this complex, information-heavy process quickly? The profile of the early adopter isn't just about having access to capital, it's cognitive.
That's the key distinction. Earlier adopters, they show specific personality variables. They have higher empathy, less dogmatism, a more favorable attitude toward change, and the single most critical trait, a greater ability to cope with uncertainty and risk.
Which means the people who adapt fastest are those who are psychologically comfortable operating in a state of high doubt. They don't need all the answers before they proceed. They accept the possibility of failure as a cost to progress.
And that comfort with uncertainty is exactly what the system struggles with. If the goal of the entire diffusion process is uncertainty reduction, but the early adopters are the only ones comfortable with high uncertainty, you immediately run into a natural bottleneck.
Which leads us directly to the core self-criticism of the theory, the pro-innovation bias. This assumption that the innovation is always beneficial and that it should be adopted quickly by everyone.
Rogers himself lamented this. He noted that researchers, naturally they focused on success stories, the corn that got adopted, the tech that went mainstream. They operated with this intrinsic bias that validated their work if the diffusion was fast.
The mic drop quote that Rogers himself offered as a self-criticism really speaks volumes about this oversight. He said, "We know too much about innovation successes and not enough about innovation failures. We fail to rigorously study non-adoption, delayed adoption, and just the messy reality of implementation."
This failure point, the rejection or non-adoption, is where the sociological process connects directly to individual psychology. It connects via cognitive bias. These systematic, predictable errors in thinking that arise when our brains try to take shortcuts to process information.
And the specific bias that really locks individuals out of progress is belief perseverance. It is the fierce attempt to avoid cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable mental conflict that arises when new information contradicts a deeply held existing belief.
And the visible behavior of belief perseverance is confirmation bias. You actively filter your environment to seek out information that affirms what you already believe, while you discount or outright discard contradictory evidence.
In a high-stakes, real-world scenario, the consequences are enormous. Think about a manager who personally championed a failed strategy 6 months ago. New data confirms the strategy is failing, but they are psychologically locked in. They might only hire team members who agree with the original strategy, or they might choose to measure success only using metrics that confirm a positive outcome, ignoring the overall business decline.
And this is often exacerbated by conservatism bias, right? Where people put too much weight on their original pre-existing information and they fail to adequately update their stance when new contradictory data emerges. If a strategy was successful for 20 years, the belief in its efficacy is so strong that 1 year of failure is just dismissed as an anomaly rather than treated as a critical signal of a new reality.
Exactly. So how do we fight this inertia? How do we force our minds out of this comfortable rut?
The mitigation strategies are all about conscious, deliberate interruption of that pattern. First, the sources stress the absolute necessity of being acutely aware that the bias exists. It's an intellectual blind spot you have to constantly check. Second, you have to diversify your inputs and the people around you. If everyone around you confirms your worldview, your confirmation bias will never be challenged.
And third, you have to actively seek out the poison pill. You must deliberately seek out contradictory information, contrarian opinions, or that single piece of data that actively attempts to prove your core belief wrong. You have to make the effort to look for that black swan.
That concept of deliberately seeking the black swan is the perfect segue.
Yeah.
We need to shift from the sociological field of adoption, what people do with ideas, to the philosophical field of truth, what ideas are. And this brings us to Karl Popper and the fundamental question he tackled, the demarcation problem.
The demarcation problem asks, how do we draw a line between rigorous predictive science and non-science, or pseudoscience? Popper realized that science could never truly prove a universal law because of the problem of induction. No matter how many white swans you see, you can't logically conclude that all swans are white forever.
So if proof isn't the goal, what is? Popper's answer was falsifiability. Let's try to define it clearly, but conversationally.
Okay, falsifiability is the logical property that a theory must possess. It has to be possible to describe a conceivable empirical observation that, if it happened, would definitively prove the theory wrong. It's the ability to define the conditions of the theory's failure before you even test it.
So it's not about finding the error, it's about establishing the rule that allows for the possibility of error.
Exactly. The crucial distinction here is that falsifiability is strictly a logical criterion, not a methodological one. The potential falsifier, that observation statement, doesn't need to be actually true or easy to measure today, only logically possible and, intersubjectively verifiable.
And this is where the black swan analogy is so powerful. The hypothesis, all swans are white, is instantly falsifiable because we can logically describe the basic statement, here's a black swan. The original hypothesis is scientific because it prohibits certain outcomes. It tells us what cannot happen.
And the power of a theory lies not in what it explains, but in what it risks by prohibiting certain states of affairs. By contrast, you can look at the truly unfalsifiable failure. Popper cited his formative encounter with Alfred Adler's psychoanalysis. It claimed that all human neuroses stem from an inferiority complex.
And the problem was that it explained every possible action.
Precisely. Popper gave this great example. If a man pushed a child into a river, Adler's theory could explain it as the man needing to assert his superiority. If, conversely, the man risked his life to save the child, the theory could still explain it as an erotic need to assert moral superiority to compensate for his inferiority complex.
So since the theory accommodated every possible outcome, it made no risky predictions. It excluded nothing. Therefore, it was scientifically useless, though maybe psychologically satisfying.
That's the key difference. You can't disprove a statement like, all human actions are egotistic. There's no objective, accepted technology that can definitively measure whether an action was not motivated by self-interest. It's an unfalsifiable statement, and therefore, it sits outside the domain of empirical science.
But testing complex ideas is messy. In a real-world lab, you're never just testing one variable. You're relying on dozens of background assumptions about your instruments, your data quality, the stability of the environment. This is the problem raised by the Duhem-Quine thesis.
Right. The thesis argues that definitive experimental falsifications are impossible because testing the main hypothesis relies on all these auxiliary hypotheses. If the experiment fails, you don't know if your core theory is wrong, or if one of those dozens of background assumptions failed. Maybe the instrument was miscalibrated or the control group wasn't properly randomized.
It's like trying to fix a complicated machine with 1,000 parts. When the machine doesn't work, you know something broke, but you don't know which part broke.
That is the methodological reality of the lab. And Popper accepted this methodological problem of falsification, the experimental act of disproving. But he insisted on the logical rigor of falsifiability, the structure of the theory itself. The logical requirement remains. The theory must be structured so that failure is possible, even if finding the definitive experimental proof of that failure is complicated.
But this philosophical rigor doesn't exist in a vacuum. If we connect this concept of testability to the modern integrity crisis, we're talking about the reproducibility crisis in science.
Yes, the failure of human methodology compromises the spirit of falsifiability. The underlying issue is often just sloppy research practices driven by the pressure to publish positive results. This includes vague hypotheses, underreporting data, and problematic analysis, all connected to the researcher degrees of freedom.
Degrees of freedom, that sounds like a bureaucratic term, but it's really a gateway to bias, isn't it?
It's the wiggle room. It's the wiggle room researchers have to manipulate their methods or data analysis after they've collected the data, searching for a statistically significant result. This post hoc searching is often called p-hacking or cherry picking. It ensures that the hypothesis they ultimately publish is not the one they started with, undermining the core principle of a risky predictive test. They end up confirming a finding rather than truly testing a hypothesis.
So, if the logical structure, falsifiability, is sound, but the human process is compromised by this flexibility and the pressure for success, how does the scientific community restore integrity?
The answer lies in the open science solutions. These are procedural practices designed to eliminate methodological bias by increasing transparency and locking in the research design before the investigation even begins.
And the most powerful solution is pre-registration. This is a commitment. Researchers have to submit their hypotheses, their methods, and their plan analysis protocols to a public registry before they collect a single data point.
This is a radical intervention because it forces the scientist to be a pure Popperian. It eliminates the ability to change the goalposts halfway through the experiment. You can't decide to only report on one specific subgroup that happened to show a significant result. It eliminates the potential for post hoc data fishing, and it restores the validity of the hypothesis test.
Second, open data and open methods. Sharing the raw data and procedural materials lets independent researchers attempt to replicate the findings.
And replication attempts are the lifeblood of falsification. They directly test the robustness and potential falsity of the original results. If the original result was due to some methodological fluke or a biased analysis, a successful replication failure restores the necessary rejection mechanism in the scientific community.
And third, reporting standards. Using standardized checklists to ensure all procedural steps and analyses are transparently detailed. This makes it easier for other scientists to assess the study's adherence to falsification standards. Essentially, open science is forcing human scientists to eliminate their own cognitive biases by removing the methodological secrecy that allows those biases to flourish.
So we've established that ideas are judged by their logical structure falsifiability and that their adoption is governed by human perception and social dynamics DOI. Now we have to confront the speed at which ideas are being generated and validated by technology. This is the source of the great intellectual lag.
Okay, let's frame this with the two laws that dictate the current pace of change. Let's start with the one everyone knows, but is now arguably the slower of the two.
Moore's law. It describes the predictable exponential growth in computing power. The number of transistors on a microchip doubles approximately every 2 years. It's a smooth, predictable, geometric progression.
But the real driver of the current AI boom is Hong's law.
Right, named for Jensen Huang of NVIDIA. This law focuses on the growth in GPU performance, which is far more critical for parallel processing and AI training. Unlike Moore's law's smooth doubling, Huang's law often exhibits this unpredictable, step-like growth pattern. It's characterized by sudden, dramatic breakthroughs where performance leaps, say, 300% in a single generation. This is where the truly radical, accelerating certainty in technological capability resides.
And the result of these dual exponential forces hitting a historically linear species, an alarming, widening technological lag. Technology advances exponentially, but human intellectual and organizational systems, they often adapt only at a linear pace. We update our curriculum yearly. The AI model updates hourly.
This lag isn't just about efficiency, it's existential. If our ability to intellectually absorb, critically evaluate, and institutionally adopt these breakthroughs continues to lag, the gap between human intellectual capacity and technological power will eventually render our traditional structures irrelevant.
To see this tension clearly, let's use the concept of the dynamic book versus the traditional textbook, which was pulled from the source material. This perfectly illustrates the difference between mere renovation and true innovation.
Current systems often use AI for renovation. They use tools like ChatGPT to auto-generate multiple-choice quizzes or streamline grading efficiency. This is using powerful, exponential technology to improve existing linear assembly line education models without questioning the foundational assumption that standardized learning is the goal.
But the dynamic book is true innovation. It fundamentally rethinks the process of knowledge transfer. It's an interactive learning environment that tailors itself instantly to the learner.
Imagine a massive textbook on European history. For one learner, the AI might instantly regenerate the content to use medieval economic history as the primary illustrative lens. For another learner struggling with reading comprehension, the difficulty of the vocabulary seamlessly adjusts, and the content is regenerated to focus on cultural narratives relevant to their background. It's a system designed for individuality, not uniformity.
But this kind of innovation creates immediate disruptive challenges for our rigid institutional systems. Take authorship ambiguity. If a teacher uses an LLM to generate the foundational content, and then a group of students modifies and co-creates the subsequent chapters, and the AI continuously updates the content based on feedback, who's the author?
Exactly, and the source material notes that tenure and promotion systems in academia are built on the static artifact of a published, bound book. How universities reward a collaborative, dynamic, perpetually evolving contribution. This institutional rigidity actively hinders the adoption of the most transformative tools because they don't fit the established linear credit structure.
And this brings us right back to the psychological and cultural core we discussed at the beginning, the
Well,
content problem and the punishment of effortless success.
the paradox of LLM use in academic writing is just. It's stark. Traditional education values conformity. It rewards students who can demonstrate mastery of the dogma of the field using formulaic expressions, jargon, and standard discourse structures. The goal is to reproduce established knowledge perfectly.
And what does an advanced LLM do perfectly? It reproduces the dogma of the field with linguistically flawless English, often eliminating the very effort we claim to value. The sources note that current LLMs can pass examinations set by reputable universities because those exams are designed to test conformity.
The contradiction is palpable. We reward students who perform the required conformity, but we punish the use of the tool that perfects that conformity. We call it cheating or unethical because the suffering required to achieve that conformity through traditional manual means has been removed. We are culturally rewarding the performance of suffering, the hours spent grinding out a paper, not the quality or intellectual novelty of the outcome.
So if technology is forcing the process to become effortless, we have to change the assessment entirely. We can't cling to the validation of struggle.
It necessitates a complete overhaul of how we assess knowledge. We have to shift the assessment structure away from testing repetition and formulaic mastery. Instead, we must require evidence of intelligent intervention analysis, critical thinking, synthesis of contradictory evidence, and ethical reasoning. If we don't, traditional education risks preparing students only for a past reality and failing to adapt to AI-driven advancements.
The sheer speed and scale of AI are already dismantling old intellectual boundaries that have defined research for decades. We are seeing a forced but profoundly necessary evolution in research methodology itself, leading to the convergent research paradigm.
Historically, research has been divided into this cherished, almost religious binary: quantitative versus qualitative, objective numbers versus subjective narratives.
Right. Quantitative research emphasizes objective, statistically rigorous numerical analysis, seeking broad generalizability across large populations. And qualitative research focuses on subjective, narrative-driven approaches, emphasizing depth, context, and rich description of experience. Never the twain shall meet. Or so we thought.
But the emerging capability of LLMs is blurring this line completely. LLMs can now analyze massive qualitative datasets, thousands of interviews, open-ended learner feedback, historical documents, and apply rigorous quantitative methodologies to them.
So this means LLMs can quantify themes, frequencies, and subtle patterns within data that was previously just too vast for human analysts to process with any rigor. For example, a researcher studying learning anxiety might use an LLM to process thousands of student journals, enabling them to identify subtle learner subgroups, like those struggling with anxiety specifically related to peer comparison versus anxiety related to time constraints, and then apply statistical rigor to those subjective insights.
And this convergence, applying statistical insight to subjective data, it's not a planned feature. It's an emergent property of LLMs, a product of human ingenuity in directing the tools.
But as powerful as this convergence is, the sources do caution that current AI still has significant limits. Current AI, which we can call artificial or augmented intelligence, it primarily focuses on improving speed, scope, and accuracy. It simulates or amplifies known human intelligence.
It's a mirror. Even when it produces novel solutions like strategies in a complex game, those solutions are ultimately derived from optimizing rule-based activities learned from massive data sets of human sources. It mimics, rather than creates, truly novel thought processes divorced from its training data.
And because it mimics, it inherits our biases, our blind spots, and our limitations. If the data it trains on is a mirror of our past, flatlining intellectual capacity in certain areas, then AI augmentation alone will only help us achieve our existing plateau faster. Simply augmenting linear human capacity will not be enough to close the exponential gap.
We need a fundamental break.
Yeah.
We need what the sources are defining as alternative intelligence, AI.
Alternative intelligence. This is a new intellectual paradigm that has to be developed explicitly and deliberately. It's focused on creating intellectual systems that are not bound by the cognitive biases, institutional rigidity, or historical limitations inherent in human cognition or historical training data.
It's an iconoclastic approach. It must be truly forward-looking, seeking to predict, adapt, evolve, and create the future, rather than simply repeating past patterns better or faster. It's about building a system that can see the black swan not just when it arrives, but before it hatches.
And achieving this requires true interdisciplinary synergy. It has to combine AI with insights from philosophy specifically, how to structure truth claims ethics, neuroscience, and critically, the perspectives of outliers.
The outliers are so key because consensus-driven organizational structures, by their very definition, usually overlook the perspective that is truly novel or contrarian. If we only listen to the majority, we are guaranteed to reinforce the historical bias of the dataset.
And that strategic breaking of conformity brings us back one last time to solving the problem of belief perseverance at the organizational level. To overcome this systemic cognitive bias and foster a truly new intellectual ecology, organizations have to engage in what we call probiotic interventions.
Probiotic interventions. I love that metaphor. You're fixing the intellectual gut biome.
Exactly. Probiotic interventions mean actively diversifying strategic decision-making tables. An organization must intentionally seek out individuals whose thought processes and professional backgrounds challenge the past operational patterns. They have to recognize that intellectual health comes from diverse, dynamic, and even contradictory inputs, ensuring that no single comfortable dogma takes over.
Because if we only consult the experts who developed the current system, the system will never fundamentally change. The exponential gap will just keep widening. We have to deliberately inject the discomfort of the new idea.
We started this deep exploration with the adoption of hybrid corn in Iowa in 1928, mapping the slow, messy, human-centric process of how new ideas navigate social systems. And we ended up facing an AI future defined by exponential laws, where technology is advancing far faster than our capacity to intellectually or institutionally adopt it.
The lesson woven through sociology, philosophy, and computer science is unified, really. The fate of any great idea, from a simple seed innovation to the complex architecture of alternative intelligence, is determined not by its objective quality, but by how effectively it navigates the messy, non-rational, bias-filled landscape of the human mind and the rigid institutional structure that houses it. We have the technology to solve countless problems. Our problem now is overcoming our own intellectual inertia.
We have to realize that intellectual systems can no longer merely adapt, they have to evolve exponentially. The exponential nature of technology demands a similar radical jump in our cognitive frameworks and our institutional structures.
The future of human intellect depends on our willingness to transition from renovation, using AI to do old things better, faster, and more easily, to true innovation, using AI to fundamentally redefine what we can think, how we can learn, and what we can collectively become. This means embracing AI not as a threat to current comfort zones, but as a catalyst for a necessary and irreversible intellectual evolution. The challenge is immense, but the opportunity to shape our own intellectual destiny is even greater.
So, given that current AI systems are essentially a highly optimized, high-speed mirror of our past human knowledge, if we successfully build an alternative intelligence that is explicitly designed to be free from human biases and historical dogma, will we even possess the cognitive tools necessary to understand its ideas?